constantly surrounding ourselves with, right? Or 1 Corinthians 15:33, for you biblical readers, evil companionships corrupt good morals, right? Paul quoting a present-day Greek poet of the day, right? Another place, he says this for Pericles, so very difficult a matter it is to trace and find out the truth of anything by history, when on the one hand, those who afterwards write it find long periods of time intercepting their view, and on the other hand, the contemporary records of any actions and lives, partly through envy and ill will, partly through favor and flattery, pervert and distort truth. Well, we of course, we know this is true even of Plutarch himself, right? Who at times, of course, is going to bend the truth, as we might say. A couple of lines just to finish at the end of the chapter. He says it this way. These are kind of some of the last words Pericles would say. He said, for, said he, no Athenian through my means ever wore mourning. One of the last comments that Pericles said about his own life. And then to finish, if we begin with the opening words of the Pericles chapter, here's the last words of this chapter. The course of public affairs after his death, Pericles' death, produced a quick and speedy sense of the loss of Pericles. Those who, while he lived, resented his great authority as that which eclipsed themselves, presently after his quitting the stage, making trial of other orators and demagogues, readily acknowledged that there never had been in nature such a disposition as his was, more moderate and reasonable in the height of that state he took upon him, or more grave and impressive in the mildness which he used, and that invidious, arbitrary power, to which formerly they gave the name of monarchy and tyranny, did then appear to have been the chief bulwark of public safety. So great a corruption and such a flood of mischief and vice followed, which he, by keeping weak and low, had withheld from notice, and had prevented from attaining incurable height through a licentious impunity. The legacy, in other words, often of an individual is not actually appreciated until after the fact. Okay, let's go to Astrides next, an ancient Athenian statesman, the great leader during the Persian War, 530 to 568 BC. He is compared with Marcus Cato in lives, although not included here. He has this great competition, that is the way Plutarch says it, with Themistocles over land power versus naval power. He dies before the rise of Pericles, and he is praised by Socrates in Plato's Gorgias and the Meno as representative of a good leader. Early on in this chapter, Plutarch will say it this way about Astrides. He says, Astrides walked, so to say, alone on his own path in politics, being unwilling in the first place to go along with his associates in ill-doing, or to cause them vexation by not gratifying their wishes. And secondly, observing that many were encouraged by the support they had in their friends to act injuriously, he was cautious, being of opinion that the integrity of his words and actions was the only right security for a good citizen. And again, you can hear the resonances in almost every one of the things I'm reading of Emerson's classic essays. Self-reliance, of course, immediately comes to mind. Let me jump to one other really quickly comment here from the Astrides chapter. As therefore they were writing the names on the shards, it's reported that an illiterate clownish fellow, giving Astrides his shard, supposing him a common citizen, begged him to write Astrides upon it. This is a fascinating moment when Astrides is about to be condemned by the Athenian people, and you have just a normal person who doesn't know who Astrides is. He can't write, and so you have to put the name on the shard of who you want to see, found guilty. And he asks Astrides to write his own name, Astrides, on the shard, and we're told, he, being surprised, asking if Astrides had ever done him any injury. And Astrides actually asked this man this. Did Astrides ever do you any injury? None at all, said he. Neither have I known the man, but I am tired of hearing him everywhere called the just. The fact that sometimes to be a good person makes you a dangerous person in the eyes of people who might be jealous. Astrides, hearing this, is said to have made no reply, but returned the shard with his own name inscribed. Tells you, Astrides didn't want to fight with him. He wrote down his own name. At his departure from the city, lifting up his hands to heaven, he made a prayer, the reverse it would seem of that of Achilles, that the Athenians might never have any occasion which should constrain them to remember Astrides. I read this passage because I want to point out to you that when you look at, of course, Achilles and the character of Achilles in the Homeric tradition, especially the Iliad, as we've said in earlier lectures, You find here a difference that's being made. Achilles, of course, rained down all kinds of punishment on his Athenian brothers at the walls of Troy. Notice Astrides says, I hope that they don't live, to regret this kind of thing. A powerful exemplar, we might say. Alcibiades is the next chapter in the Harvard Classics from 450 to 404 BCE. Of course, the Athenian Statesman, the great orator and the general. We spoke about Alcibiades in some of our lectures, of course, on Plato in the lecture on Symposium and that kind of thing. He changed alliances several times during the Peloponnesian War, from Sparta to Russia to Persia. He's a brilliant strategist and very, very controversial. He is, Alcibiades, one of the most polarizing figures in all of history. Of course, a student of Socrates and the art of rhetoric, very vain about his good looks. In 404 BC, he dies by assassins with arrows. Let's listen to just a few of the lines from Plutarch and what Plutarch has to say about him. Very early in his chapter on Alcibiades, he says it this way: "It is not, perhaps, material to say anything of the beauty of Alcibiades, only that it bloomed with him in all the ages of his life, in his infancy, in his youth, in his manhood, and in the peculiar character becoming to each of those periods, gave him in each of them a grace and a charm." And much, of course, in history has been said about Alcibiades and his good looks, right? His conduct, a few lines later, he says it this way: "His conduct displayed many great inconsistencies and variations, not unnatural, in accordance with the many and wonderful vicissitudes of his fortunes. But among the many strong passions of his real character, the one most prevailing of all was his ambition and desire of superiority, which appears in several anecdotes told of his sayings whilst he was a child. Once, being hard-pressed in wrestling and fearing to be thrown, he got the hand of his antagonist to his mouth and bit with all his force. And when the other loosened his hold presently and said, 'You bite, Alcibiades, like a woman.' 'No,' replied he, 'like a lion.'" And Plutarch loves these kinds of images. At 2b, you could put this in your notes. Plutarch loves these kinds of stories, which will give us a window into the kind of person that we're talking about. A little bit later, just a few lines later, he says it this way about Alcibiades: "It was manifest that the many well-born persons who were continually seeking his company and making their court to him were attracted and captivated by his brilliant and extraordinary beauty only. But the affection which Socrates entertained for him is a great evidence of the natural noble qualities and good disposition of the boy, which Socrates indeed detected both in and under his personal beauty. And fearing that his wealth and station, and the great number both of strangers and Athenians who flattered and caressed him, might at last corrupt him, resolved, if possible, to interpose, and preserve so hopeful a plant from perishing in the flower before its fruit came to perfection." The idea that if you are flattered too much when you're young, and you're told how great you are, Socrates said, "I was worried it might destroy the young boy. For never did fortune surround and enclose a man with so many of those things which we vulgarly call goods, or so protect him from every weapon of philosophy and fence him from every excess of free and searching words, as she did Alcibiades, who from the beginning was exposed to the flatteries of those who sought merely his gratification, such as might well unnerve him and indispose him to listen to any real advisor or instructor." Similar comments, by the way, are made of Alexander the Great, that as a young man, too much good happened to him because of his beauty and because of his charm and charisma, etc., etc., right? One final, and again, I wish that I could read more of each of these, but I haven't the time. But I will share this one with you. At the end of his chapter on Alcibiades, he says it this way. He says, "Certainly, if ever man was ruined by his own glory, it was Alcibiades. For his continual success had produced such an idea of his courage and conduct, that if he failed in anything he undertook, it was imputed to his neglect, and no one would believe it was through want of power, for they thought nothing was too hard for him if he went about it in good earnest." Well, Alcibiades is a classic example then of the young politician, beautiful, eloquent, and then of course people grow to resent him if he can't, fulfill in every way. Our next chapter in the Harvard Classics is the Coriolanus, Gaius Marcus Coriolanus chapter, the Roman general of the 5th century, named because of his actions at the siege of the famous Battle of Volscian. He's exiled from Rome. Again, this trend of often being thrown out. Once you're a hero, you kind of are thrown out. Getting too big for your britches is a famous mantra that, of course, it lives out itself in Plutarch. He led the troops of Rome's enemy, Volsci, against Rome. And some have argued, in fact, that he may be a legendary figure in the end and not actually a legitimate historical true figure. The opening lines here for Coriolanus is another window into Plutarch's prose, which I love. He says it this way: however bad men may be pleased to lay the blame of their corruptions upon their misfortune and the neglect of them and their minority, nor is he less in evidence to the truth of their opinion who conceive that a generous and worthy nature without proper discipline, like a rich soil without culture, notice this comparison, right, is apt with its better fruits to produce also much that is bad and faulty. In other words, you can have tremendous gifts, but if you don't have the right kind of soil, the seed can't grow. The same argument is going to be made here. While the force and vigor of his soul and a preserving constancy in all he undertook led him successfully into many noble achievements, yet on the other side also, by indulging the vehemence of his passion and through an obstinate reluctance to yield or accommodate his humors and sentiments to those of people around him, he rendered himself incapable of acting and associating with others. Not socially aware enough. Those who saw with admiration how proof his nature was against all the softness of pleasure, the hardships of service, the allurements of gain, while allowing to that universal firmness of his the respective names of temperance, fortitude, here come, of course, the Platonic virtues, justice. Yet in the life of the citizen, the statesman would not choose but be disgusted at the severity and ruggedness of his deportment, and with his overbearing, haughty, and imperious temper. Education and study and the favors of the Muses confer no greater benefit on those that seek them than these humanizing and civilizing lessons which teach our natural qualities to submit to the limitations prescribed by reason and to avoid the wildness of extremes. Go back to our lecture on Bacon's essay of studies and his word picture, and Bacon obviously borrowing heavily from Plutarch, his idea that natural abilities are like natural plants and need pruning. The same argument is in play here as well. To continue just a few lines later, he says this as well, just a couple of quick lines. He says, he had never learned, and now he's speaking again of Coriolanus, he had never learned how essential it is for anyone who undertakes public business and desires to deal with mankind, to avoid above all things that self-will, which, as Plato says, belongs to the family of solitude, and to pursue above all things that capacity so generally ridiculed of submission to ill treatment, the willingness to put up with poor treatment or whatever, emphasized. A number of pages later, and now moving towards the end of it, he says, your wife and children are under the sad necessity that they must either be deprived of you or of their native soil. As for myself, he says, I'm resolved not to wait till war shall determine this alternate for me, but if I cannot prevail with you to prefer amenity and concord to quarrel and hostility, and to be the benefactor of both parties, rather than the destroyer of one of them, be assured of this from me, and reckon steadfastly upon it, that you shall not be able to reach your country unless you trample first upon the corpse of her that brought you into life. This is the great story of his mother, who says to him at the end, you must not destroy these people. I'm going to stand in your way. And it's a wonderful story that that works, right? He decides, okay, I won't do it. And for that, of course, Mama is given all kinds of celebration. Now, we next will have a quick comparison of Alcibiades with Coriolanus, and early on he says it this way: neither of these courses can be called commendable, or he says, but a man who ingratiates himself by indulgence and flattery is hardly so censurable as one who, to avoid the appearance of flattery, insults. To seek power by servility to the people is a disgrace. Machiavelli will argue otherwise. But to maintain it by terror, violence, and oppression is not a disgrace only, but an injustice. And a line like this, of course, for us is significant because of our study of Machiavelli's Prince, right? Just to finish this comparison, he says it this way: as regards money. And money is, for Plutarch, one of the things that really does damage a whole lot of the people he writes about. As regards money, Alcibiades, we are told, was often guilty of procuring it by accepting bribes and spent it ill in leisure and in luxury and dissipation. In other words, he partied too much. Coriolanus declined to receive it, even when pressed upon him by his commanders, as an honor. And one great reason for the odium he incurred with the populace in the discussions about their deaths was that he trampled upon the poor, not for money's sake, but out of pride and insolence. Let's put it in our notes. Plutarch is constantly reminding us of the importance of what Aristotle called the golden mean, right? That balance between the two. You can't go, one way or the other too much. Okay, in Harvard Classics, Democracies is the next, of course, the great statesman, but also the greatest orator of them all. The perfect orator. Democracies is often called, right, of ancient Athens. 384 to 322 BCE. In the 4th century, he learned how to speak by studying the great orators before him. He spoke often against Philip II of Macedon. He led the uprising against Alexander the Great and, of course, failed. He took his own life when hunted down by Antipater, right? Democracies, we mentioned, of course, about him because he's such an important figure in the idea of learning how to speak well. This is the way early on Plutarch talks about it. Other arts, whose end is to acquire riches or honor, are likely enough to wither and decay in poor and undistinguished towns. But virtue, like a strong and durable plant, may take root and thrive in any place where it can lay hold of an ingenious nature and a mind that is industrious. In other words, you do not have to be born into a really remarkable situation if you're willing to work hard. What we in 303 have often called, of course, sustained will, that idea of sustained will, right? A couple of lines later, he says it this way. The divine power seems originally to have designed Demosthenes and Cicero upon the same plan. We, of course, have studied Cicero elsewhere, and we're going to get to him again. Giving them many similarities in natural characters as their passion for distinction, their love of liberty and civil life, their want of courage in dangers in war, and at the same time also to have added many accidental resemblances. I think there can hardly be found two other orators who, from small and obscure beginnings, became so great and mighty, who both contested with kings and tyrants, both lost their daughters, were driven out of their country and returned with honor, who flying from thence again were both seized upon by their enemies and at last ended their lives with the liberty of their countrymen. So that if we were to suppose there had been a trial of skill between nature and fortune, as there is sometimes between artists, it would be hard to judge whether that succeeded best in making them alike in their dispositions and manners, or this, in the coincidences of their lives. And then he begins by saying, we're going to speak of the eldest first, and then he goes into Demosthenes, right? One other line that I'll read for you, which is famous, the idea of Demosthenes had to learn how to speak well. There is some debate that maybe, in fact, he was a stutterer of a kind. We're told his inarticulate and stammering pronunciation he overcame and rendered more distinct by speaking with pebbles in his mouth. The famous idea that Demosthenes had these pebbles that were put in his mouth. His voice he disciplined by declaiming and reciting speeches or verses when he was out of breath while running or going up steep places. And that in his house he had a large looking glass before which he would stand and go through his exercises. This idea that if you really want to be successful in the world of politics, in the world of business or whatever, you have to be a practiced speaker, orator, and elocution matters. And if you're not good at it, then you need to practice at it. It's an interesting idea, and of course it's vital to what Plutarch will suggest. So many of these great leaders had the capacity to stand up and speak in front of others. The next chapter is Cicero. We, of course, in the Harvard Classics lecture number 69, that's volume 9 of the Harvard Classics, we worked with Cicero's on friendship and as well on old age, you'll remember. Well, I've given full biography here, so I'm going to go really fast. Born 3rd of January 106, dies 7th of December 43, a year after Caesar in the Ides of March. He's a Roman statesman, of course, again, amazing orator, a lawyer, a philosopher. Rome's greatest orator. Consul in the year 63 BC. He's a big supporter, of course, of conservative values and the Republic. After JC's death, of course, he's the enemy of Mark Antony. He's executed by soldiers 7 December 43 BCE. Of course, they will sever his hands and his head, display it, take out his tongue, display it in the Roman Forum, and a lot of that is, of course, just Mark Antony. And in the very last chapter of this Harvard Classics volume, Mark Antony is the chapter, and we'll come back to that idea. The lines, and there's so many great ones in his treatment of Cicero, but I'll just start here. Nevertheless, he says about Cicero, he was always excessively pleased with his own praise and continued to the very last to be passionately fond of glory, which often interfered with the prosecution of his wisest resolutions. Put this in your notes. Plutarch has a clearly love-hate relationship with the idea of ambition. It's good to be ambitious, but it's also very dangerous to be too ambitious. You got to keep it in check, that kind of thing, right? And he says Cicero sometimes could not do that. For Cicero, he says a few lines later, it may be said, was the one man above all others who made the Romans feel how great a charm eloquence lends to what is good, and how invincible justice is if it be well spoken, and that it is necessary for him who would dexterously govern a commonwealth in action, always to prefer that which is honest before that which is popular, and in speaking to free the right and useful measure from everything that may occasion offense. Again, that notion of being the good speaker is huge. I'll give you one final line from this one. Near the end he says, and yet Cicero often desired his friends not to call him orator, but philosopher, because he had made philosophy his business and had only used rhetoric as an instrument for attaining his objects in public life. But the desire of glory has great power in washing the tinctures of philosophy out of the souls of men, and in imprinting the passions of the common people by custom and conversation in the minds of those that take a part in governing them, unless the politician be very careful so to engage in public affairs as to interest himself only in the affairs themselves, but not participate in the passions that are consequent to them. Getting what you want can sometimes lead to problems. Think about our mantra from our study of Macbeth. He got what he wanted, but he lost what he had. And of course, we'll see this in the treatment of Cicero as well. We then will have a comparison between Democracies and Cicero, the two great orators, one of the Greeks and one of the Romans. And I'll read just a couple of lines. At the very opening lines, he says, one may discover the different temper of each of them in their speeches. This idea of studying the speeches is a key insight, right? And indeed, a few lines later he says, Cicero was by natural temper very much disposed to mirth and pleasant